When Muhammad went on his spiritual retreat to a cave on Mount Hira each year during the month of Ramadan, he did so in order to engage in secluded contemplation. This was a common practice at the time for men to go to Mecca and spend a month performing devotions and distributing alms to the poor. They visited the statues of the tribal deities. Muhammad spent time performing devotions. Presumably, this was a way for him to rest, recharge, and feel calmer and more grounded. A time for reconnecting to his ancestors and the gods of his ancestors. It is most likely this tradition of a spiritual retreat was something his grandfather had introduced to him. He took this retreat every year for a month and had been doing so since he was young. Muhammad spent a lot of time in prayer and meditation. His time in the cave combined social concerns with prayer. He knew intimately the plight of widows and orphans in the tribal culture of 7th century Arabia because his father had died while his mother was still pregnant with him, and his mother died when he was just 6 years old. Now, at the age of 40, he had achieved much. He was a respected caravaner and businessman who was known widely to be trustworthy and dependable. In addition, he had had the great fortune of a marriage proposal from Khadija, a wealthy widow whom he married and with whom he shared everything, including his inner thoughts, his hopes, his dreams, and fears. It was during one of his times of spiritual retreat on Mount Hira in the year 610 when Muhammad received the first of many revelations that are the Quran. He experienced this revelation as an astonishing and dramatic attack. He felt a great pressure bearing down on him, so tight that he almost could not breathe. He thought he was being attacked by an evil spirit. He fled from the cave and stumbled to the top of the mountain. There, he had another vision. He saw a mighty being that filled the horizon and stood unmoving and gazing at him. He tried to turn away, but in whatever area of the sky he looked, he saw the being. This was the spirit of revelation that Muhammad would later call Gabriel. He experienced the angel as a transcendent presence that defied ordinary human description. Terrified and still unable to understand what had happened to him, Muhammad stumbled down the mountainside to his beloved wife, Khadija. By the time he reached her, he was crawling on his hands and knees and trembling all over. Khadija wrapped him in a blanket and held him close to calm him. I can't help but wonder if Muhammad would have encountered the divine if it were not for his practice of an annual spiritual retreat. Mystics and deeply religious people from all religions around the globe have spiritual experiences during times of meditation, prayer, and fasting. They don't all manifest so dramatically as in the example of the angel Gabriel visiting Muhammad, or when the Buddha was visited by Mara, or when Krishna revealed himself to Prince Arjuna. These are not run-of-the-mill experiences of the divine. Nevertheless, there are thousands of accounts of the everyday religious practitioner having an encounter with the divine during times of spiritual practice. Often this manifests as a feeling of transcendence and clarity of heart, of spirit, of mind. Lay practitioners in most religions are encouraged to set time and space aside for regular spiritual practice. Many of us here today have one or more spiritual practices. I invite you now to bring to mind your spiritual practices. Do you have a practice that looks and feels like a traditionally understood practice, such as prayer before a meal or morning meditation? Do you have a nature-based spiritual practice, such as a regular walk or spending time in nature, or ceremonies at the time of the equinox and solstice to mark the turning of the earth and the changing of the seasons? Perhaps you go on a spiritual retreat of some sort. Maybe it is a silent retreat, a yoga retreat, or a writing retreat, or maybe it's a combination of all three. Maybe your spiritual practice is rooted in your ancestral heritage. Repeated and regular spiritual practices offer us the opportunity to remove ourselves from the daily grind, to slow down, to feel a sense of the sacred, to, as Carrie pointed out, breathe and notice our breathing and get in touch with what is fundamentally of the most importance in our lives. If you Google benefits of spiritual practices, you get about 56,900,000 results. So there must be something to it. Take Muhammad and his spiritual retreat during the month of Ramadan, for example. Muslims all over the world participate in this annual practice. Ramadan takes place during the 9th month in the Muslim lunar calendar and is the holiest month of the year for Muslims. It is so important that it is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is a period, as Nafisa mentioned, it is a period of introspection, of reading, of communal prayer, and participation in charitable acts. It marks the time when Allah gave Muhammad the revelations of the Quran. We are approaching the beginning of Ramadan, which starts tomorrow at sundown and ends with the celebratory feast of Eid al-Fitr at sundown on Wednesday, May 12th. A major component of Ramadan is the practice of fasting from sun up to sundown each day. Of course, Muslims are not the only religious community who engage in this particular form of spiritual practice. Fasting has been practiced for thousands of years by millions of people of many different religions. Jews fast for 25 hours on Yom Kippur and several other fast days during the year. Christians often undertake some kind of fast during Lent as a way of connecting to Jesus's 40-day fast in the desert. Hindus fast on certain days of the week to harmonize with spiritual forces. Religious people often describe fasting not as a form of deprivation, but instead as a form of spiritual nourishment. They describe it as growing a deeper connection to the sacred or divine presence. This often leads them to loosen their attachments to things that are ultimately revealed as unimportant. For some, it serves to provide them with some kind of clarity of mind and heart that they don't otherwise have. Some even describe it as offering a kind of clarity that enables them to see the ways they have been deceiving themselves. Here's the thing about Ramadan and fasting, though. As I understand it, it's not just about the individual. Instead, Ramadan includes a communal aspect. There is personal introspection, praying and reading. There is also communal prayer and the daily breaking of the fast with family after sundown. And this is a key element of the practice. There's also a component of Ramadan that emphasizes putting oneself in the shoes of the less fortunate and engaging in charitable acts. The more I have studied and learned about religious spiritual practices like this that combine the individual introspection, communal prayer, and feasting, and doing charitable acts, the more I feel a deep need for this in our Unitarian Universalist communities. We do have some, but I would say that here in the US, many UUs have been practicing a highly individualistic and intellectually based religion for several generations. Not everyone, of course, but it has skewed that way. Even when Thoreau went to live deliberately in the woods, he rarely mentioned his interactions with other people, but focused on his individual communion with nature. I think that's really important too. And I don't mean to imply that there's anything inherently wrong with having our individual spiritual experiences. No, on the contrary, these are beautiful, moving, and necessary for a fulfilled life. And what if we saw these as part of a whole experience that includes a community aspect, whether that is about friends, family, or our church community? UU groups will come together on Sundays for a service and for fellowship. A small percentage of the group participate in organizing and running the institution, and for many, this is not considered a spiritual endeavor, but more a practical activity born of the necessity of keeping the institution alive and running. We are changing that. More and more of you, our leaders, are seeing your work in our community as a spiritual calling, as spiritual work, as a ministry. I wonder if we can be the UUs who change that pattern completely and find a way to embrace religious practices, both individually and communally. I mean, change that pattern of just showing up on Sunday morning, right? Like those of you who are leaders who are already embodying this as a ministry, how can we do that all together? We've been doing church 7 days a week for over a year now. And I, for one, am looking forward to seeing how we continue that kind of connection as we begin to come back to worshiping and praying and engaging in many other spiritual practices in person. And maybe even in some sort of hybrid version. We get to choose how we move forward. Something that might be an obstacle on one's path of engaging with deep spiritual practices is what I kind of think of as an intimidation factor. If you think of spiritual practices as too difficult, or really only for those people who are super uber religious or mystical to the point of being otherworldly, you are not alone. But I'm here today to make a case for spiritual practice that is accessible, doable, and for all of us. For some, the idea of a spiritual practice can lead them down the path of competition and think of it as like something one must do over and over in order to get really good at. Practice makes perfect, right? This is one more way for us potentially to just be like competing with ourselves and others and to set ourselves up for failure. Our dominant cultural narrative constantly reinforces this progress narrative, so much so that it even seeps into our spiritual lives. So I want to invite you today to consider spiritual practice as a countercultural act. Take the practice of keeping a Sabbath, for example. We can think of this as unstructured time set aside for engaging with the spiritual, and also for simply not doing what we usually do, not consuming. So this means not running errands, not even cleaning, no checking our smartphones or streaming Netflix, no doom scrolling through the news headlines, checking what fabulous things your Facebook friends are doing, or impulse buying from Instagram ads. Instead, set aside some time from your usual routine and activities. Maybe go for a wandering walk or bus ride through the city, looking for beauty. Maybe set aside time from your usual routine in order to make art, make music, take a nap, read spiritual texts or novels, pray, dance, meditate, do yoga or Tai Chi, cook and eat meals with family or friends as you are able to and safely. When we are constantly moving from one thing to the next, it is easier to deny our true needs. And it is easier, simply put, to lie to ourselves or cover up what it is that we truly give ultimate importance to in our short lives on this earth. As my colleague, Reverend Anna in Brooklyn, once wrote about the benefits of having a regular Sabbath practice, quote, "It's a little cliche, but it's cliche because by all accounts, it's true. When we're lying on our deathbeds, the things that are going to matter to us are the time we spent with people we loved. Having loved and prioritized well, having grown into our most authentic selves, our memories of beauty and those rare shining moments when we felt spiritually connected to all of life. These are all experiences that are beautifully cultivated by some kind of intentional spiritual practice and are somewhat difficult to come by without it. So I'd like to invite each of you to dip your toe or perhaps dive or even cannonball into the water of spiritual practice. Maybe you've been thinking about revisiting an old practice you haven't done in a while, or refreshing a current practice. Or maybe you have a regular practice and you are just fine with that. Perhaps this whole spiritual practice thing is new to you. It sounds, I don't know, kind of funny or hokey, but you're curious and willing to give it a try. I and your team of clergy and staff are here to help, are here and happy to talk with you, to help you figure out a version that will work for you. Something you can engage with as a spiritual practice and stick to, but also stretches you. Something that allows you to practice without the urgency and pressure to make it perfect. Because spiritual practices are not about achieving and perfection. They are simply about the intention and action of doing. As Emerson once said, once you make a decision, the whole universe conspires to make it happen. The whole universe. Now that's my kind of support system. And my friends, don't worry if you aren't visited by the angel Gabriel. Your spiritual practice is perfect anyway. Amen.